June 1944, somewhere behind the Normandy coastline, a German signals intelligence post, one of dozens operated by the Hurtgen intercept service along the invasion front. The room is underground, reinforced with concrete, lit by electric lamps that hum against the percussion of distant naval guns. 3 operators sit at receiver sets, headphones clamped tight, pencils moving across transcription pads. Their job is to listen to American tactical radio traffic, copy it down, and pass it to the cryptanalysts in the next room, who will break it open and extract whatever the Americans are saying to each other. It is a job these men are extraordinarily good at. They have been doing it since the invasion of Poland. They have been doing it through 5 years of war on multiple fronts. They have broken American tactical codes before. They will break them again tomorrow. The equipment works. The procedures work. The mathematics work. On this particular frequency, at this particular hour, the operators are doing exactly what they have been trained to do. They are scanning the band. They are logging call signs. They are copying transmissions. And then one of them stops writing. He adjusts the dial. He presses the headphones tighter against his skull. He listens for another 30 seconds, then pulls one earpiece away and says something to the man beside him. The second operator tunes to the same frequency. He listens. He shakes his head. They call over a senior technician. The technician listens. Nobody writes anything down because there is nothing to write. What they are hearing is a human voice. That much is clear. The signal is strong. The transmission discipline is professional. The pacing measured. The pauses clean. This is not an untrained operator fumbling with a microphone. This is a man who knows how to use a radio. But the content is not German. It is not English. It is not French or Russian or any of the roughly 24 European languages the Hurtgen has catalogued in its training manuals. It is not Morse code. It is not a mechanical cipher output. It is a voice speaking what sounds like a language, but a language that fits no pattern any of them have ever encountered. The vowel sounds are wrong for any European tongue. The consonant clusters do not match any Indo-European root. The rhythms have a tonal quality that European languages do not possess. If you did not know it was a human being on the other end, you might reasonably conclude the equipment was malfunctioning and that something had gone wrong in the circuitry, and the receiver was producing distorted noise shaped roughly like speech. This is the detail that the entire story turns on. The German Signals Intelligence Service in 1944 was not a collection of amateurs stumbling through the radio spectrum. It was one of the most capable cryptanalytic organizations on Earth. The Hurtgen, the Armed Forces Intercept Service, had been operating since the mid-1930s. Its operators had monitored Soviet military traffic during the invasion of Russia. They had intercepted British communications during the North Africa campaign. They had tracked French resistance transmissions and helped the Gestapo locate clandestine radio operators across occupied Europe. By the time the Allies landed in France, German intercept units had broken American tactical codes that the Americans believed were secure. They were reading Allied traffic in some cases within hours of transmission. They understood American radio procedures. They recognized American call sign patterns. They could identify American unit movements by analyzing traffic volume even before they broke the content. They had the equipment, they had the trained linguists, they had the mathematics, and they were exceptionally good at it. On any normal day, a German intercept operator scanning American frequencies would hear English-language voice traffic, Morse code transmissions using standard military procedure, and encrypted signals from cipher machines that followed recognizable patterns even before the content was decrypted. All of this was material the Hurtgen knew how to process. It was the raw material of signals intelligence, and the German system was built to turn raw material into operational advantage. And yet, on a frequency carrying voice traffic from the American Fourth Infantry Division, they could not identify the language being spoken. They could not categorize it. They could not begin to analyze it. They could not even determine with confidence whether it was a language at all or simply noise. This is the story of why. It is the story of 17 men from Oklahoma who carried into the most devastating war in human history a weapon that no army on Earth could have manufactured, no government could have requisitioned, and no intelligence service could have defeated. It was not a machine. It was not a cipher. It was a language that their own government had spent 60 years trying to destroy. And it is the story of how the men who spoke it went from being punished for using it in childhood to being decorated for using it in war. To understand how a language spoken by fewer than 2,000 people on the southern plains of Oklahoma ended up confounding the most sophisticated signals, intelligence apparatus in Europe, we have to go back further than the war. We have to go back further than the army. We have to go to a place that most Americans in 1944 had never heard of, and most Americans today would prefer to forget. We have to go to the schools. In 1879, a United States Army officer named Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Pratt had served in the Indian Wars. He had commanded a unit of African-American Buffalo soldiers and had overseen Native American prisoners of war at Fort Marion in Florida. He believed, with the full conviction of a man who considered himself progressive for his era, that Native Americans could be assimilated into white American society, but only if everything that made them Native American was systematically stripped away. His philosophy, which he stated publicly and which became the explicit policy of the United States government for the next 5 decades, was captured in a phrase he delivered at an 1892 conference. He said, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." The idea was simple and it was brutal. Take Native American children from their families, sometimes by persuasion, sometimes by coercion, sometimes by force. Ship them to boarding schools hundreds of miles from their reservations, cut their hair, dress them in military-style uniforms, forbid them from speaking their languages, punish them when they did, replace everything they knew, every story, every song, every word their mothers had spoken to them, with English, with Christianity, with manual trades, with obedience. Produce, at the other end of the process, something that looked enough like a white American to be considered civilized. The schools operated on a military model, with uniforms, drilling, rigid schedules, and corporal punishment. Children were assigned new English names. They were separated from siblings to prevent them from speaking their native language to each other. Many children did not see their families for years at a time. Carlisle was the model. Dozens of similar schools followed across the country, from New Mexico to Montana, from Oklahoma to Wisconsin. By the early 20th century, tens of thousands of Native American children had passed through a system designed with cold institutional precision to eliminate the very thing that made them who they were. And the enforcement was not gentle. Children who spoke their native language were beaten. They were locked in closets. They were made to stand holding heavy objects for hours. In some schools, they had their mouths washed with lye soap for speaking a word of Comanche or Navajo or Cherokee. The message was absolute. Your language is not wanted here. Your language is a mark of backwardness. Your language belongs to a world we are going to erase, and we will drive it out of you by whatever means necessary. Among the children who passed through this system was a boy named Charles Chibitty. He was born on November 20th, 1921, in a tent near Medicine Park, Oklahoma, a member of the Comanche Nation. On his mother's side, he was a descendant of Chief Ten Bears, one of the great Comanche leaders, a man who had signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, the treaty that was supposed to guarantee the Comanche people a homeland on the southern plains. Chibitty's Comanche name translates roughly to holding on good. He was sent first to the Fort Sill Indian School, then later to Haskell Indian School in Lawrence, Kansas. At Fort Sill, he was punished for speaking Comanche, the language that had been spoken across the southern Great Plains for centuries, the language his mother had taught him at home, the language that connected him to 10 Bears and to every Comanche who had ever lived, was forbidden inside those walls. He was told it had no value. He was told it had no place in the modern world. He was told to stop using it. He did not stop. Neither did the other Comanche children at those schools. They spoke it to each other in whispers, in dormitories after lights out, in corners of the yard where the teachers could not hear. They kept the language alive the way people keep anything alive that someone is trying to kill. They hid it. And they waited. What none of them could have known, what Charles Chibitty could not possibly have imagined as a child being disciplined for speaking his own language, was that within 20 years the United States Army would come to the Comanche Nation and ask them to do the one thing the United States government had spent his entire childhood trying to prevent. The Army would ask them to speak Comanche, and it would ask them to do it in the middle of the deadliest war the world had ever seen, because that language, the one they had been told was worthless, was going to turn out to be the one thing the enemy could not defeat. The idea of using Native American languages as military codes did not begin with the Second World War. It began in the First. In October of 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in northeastern France, an American colonel named Alfred Blore of the 142nd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, had a problem that was costing lives. German intelligence was intercepting every message his regiment sent by telephone or runner. The Germans had broken the American field codes. They had captured American soldiers who spoke German and were using them to monitor telephone lines. They were reading American communications almost in real time, and they were using the information to prepare for American attacks before the first soldier went over the top. Blore knew he had Choctaw soldiers in his regiment. He knew the Choctaw language had never been written down in any form the Germans could study. There was no Choctaw dictionary in any library in Germany. There was no Choctaw grammar in any university in Europe. He made a decision that would change the history of military communication. He put 2 Choctaw speakers on field telephones at opposite ends of the line and told them to transmit orders in Choctaw. The Choctaw men improvised military terms on the spot. A machine gun became a little gun shoot fast. Poison gas became bad air. Artillery became big gun. Casualties became scalps. They turned their language into a weapon in real time, without training, without preparation, without a manual. Within 24 hours, the Germans noticed that American communications had changed. They could still intercept the transmissions. They could still hear the voices on the wire, but they could no longer understand a single word. The effect on German command in that sector was immediate and devastating. Their intelligence dried up overnight. They were operating blind. A withdrawal that Blore ordered on October 26th was executed without the Germans anticipating it. An attack on a position called Forest Firm went forward without the Germans preparing for it. The Choctaw telephone squad had done something no cipher machine in existence could do at that speed. They had made American communications invisible to the enemy in a matter of hours. The Choctaw operated for only a few weeks before the armistice ended the war, but the idea had been proven. A language that existed outside the entire framework of European linguistics, that had no written form, no published grammar, no dictionary a foreign intelligence service could obtain, was not merely difficult to break. It was impossible to break. You could not cryptanalyze something that was not a code in any mathematical sense. It was a living language. To break it, you would have to learn it. And to learn it, you would need a native speaker willing to teach you, and years of immersion in the culture that produced it. The Germans had neither. Between the wars, the idea lay mostly dormant. The American military filed the Choctaw experiment as an interesting curiosity and moved on to developing mechanical cipher machines and mathematical encryption systems. The assumption was that modern cryptography would render language-based codes obsolete. Machines were predictable. Machines could be mass-produced. Machines did not require finding speakers of obscure languages and convincing them to serve. The military establishment, as military establishments tend to do, chose the solution that looked like engineering over the solution that looked like culture. But there was a problem with the engineering solution, and it was a problem that the Germans would eventually prove. Machines are systems. Systems have patterns. Patterns, given enough time and enough intercepted traffic, can be broken. The history of cryptography in the 20th century is, in many ways, a story of machines being built and then being broken, in a cycle that repeated itself faster and faster as the mathematicians on both sides grew more capable. The Choctaw telephone experiment had worked on a completely different principle. It had not been a system at all. It had been a human capability, and human capabilities cannot be reverse-engineered by a man sitting at a desk with a pencil and a frequency chart. The military professionals who dismissed the Choctaw experiment as a curiosity were thinking like engineers. They should have been thinking like anthropologists. In 1940, as the United States began preparing for a war that many in Washington believed was inevitable, The army looked at the Choctaw idea again with fresh eyes. Cherokee soldiers of the 30th Division had also used their language in the autumn of 1918, possibly even before the Choctaw, and the broader concept had proven sound. This time, the service expanded its search beyond the Choctaw. This time, it reached for the Comanche. The Comanche language was, from a cryptographic standpoint, an almost perfect instrument. It belonged to the Uto-Aztecan family, specifically the Central Numic branch, closely related to Shoshone but mutually unintelligible with most other Native American languages. This mutual unintelligibility was important. Even if a German intelligence service had somehow obtained a speaker of Navajo or Choctaw or Cherokee, that speaker would have been useless against Comanche. The distances between Native American language families are often greater than the distances between European languages. A Navajo speaker listening to Comanche would understand no more than an English speaker listening to Mandarin Chinese. Each language was its own sealed world. Comanche was tonal, meaning that the same syllable spoken at different pitches carried entirely different meanings. A word that sounded identical to an untrained ear could mean two completely different things depending on whether the speaker's voice rose or fell. It was polysynthetic, meaning that a single Comanche word could contain what English would require an entire sentence to express, with layers of prefixes, suffixes, and embedded grammatical markers that followed rules no European linguist without years of specialized training would recognize. Most importantly, it had never been systematically written down. There were no published Comanche grammars available in any European library. There were no Comanche dictionaries. There were no Comanche textbooks. A German anthropologist named Gunther Wagner had conducted fieldwork among the Comanche in 1932, producing some ethnographic notes, but these were scattered academic records, not a usable linguistic reference. The total number of fluent Comanche speakers in the world at that time was fewer than 2,000, almost all of them living within a small area of southwestern Oklahoma. The idea that a German cryptanalyst sitting in a concrete bunker in France could learn Comanche from any available published source was not merely unlikely, it was physically impossible. The source did not exist. In December of 1940 and January of 1941, the United States Army recruited 17 Comanche men from the area around Lawton, Oklahoma. Their names deserve to be spoken, because for decades almost nobody spoke them. Charles Chibitty, Haddon Codina, Robert Holder, Forrest Kassanavoid, Wellington Mihekabe, Perry Noyabad, Clifford Otitivo, Simmons Parker, Melvin Permansu, Hurtgen Red Elk, Roderick Red Elk, Albert Naquadi Jr., Larry Saupitty, Morris Tabiachi, Anthony Tabitite, Ralph Warney, Willie Yakashi. They were young men, most of them teenagers or in their early 20s. Some had been farmers, some had been laborers. Several had attended the same government boarding schools that had tried to beat their language out of them. Charles Chibitty enlisted on January 2, 1941, at the age of 19, with his mother's permission and his father's encouragement. His father told him, "Go ahead, it might do you some good." They were assigned to the 4th Signal Company, 4th Infantry Division, and sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for basic training. They trained not only in radio operation but in field telephone systems, Morse code, and semaphore signaling. They learned to string wire, to splice broken lines, to set up and operate the switchboards that connected platoons to companies, companies to battalions, and battalions to the division headquarters that coordinated the entire operation. They were, first and foremost, signal soldiers. The code talking was layered on top of a complete set of military communication skills. The drill instructors noticed something immediately. The Comanche men adapted to military discipline faster than most recruits. They fell into formation without being told twice. They already understood rigid schedules and immediate punishment for infractions. They saluted cleanly and followed orders crisply. When asked if they had prior military experience, they said no. They said they had attended Indian schools. The boarding school system, the same system that had tried to erase their identity, had accidentally produced men who were already conditioned for the exact environment the army was putting them into. The irony was perfect and it was cruel. In August of 1941, the 17 Comanche soldiers were placed under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Hugh Foster, a recent graduate of West Point. Foster's assignment was extraordinary. He was to help the men develop a coded military communication system built entirely on the Comanche language. Foster provided approximately 250 specialized military terms, the complete tactical vocabulary of modern warfare, and told the Comanche soldiers to create coded equivalents in their own language. They did it the way their ancestors had always described the world, through metaphor and observation. A tank became wakarie, the Comanche word for turtle, because a tank moved like a turtle, armored, slow, close to the ground. A bomber became a pregnant airplane, because it carried something inside it that it was about to deliver. Bombs became baby birds. A machine gun became a sewing machine gun, tutsakuna tawawi, because the rapid hammering sound of automatic fire reminded the men of a sewing machine running at high speed. Adolf Hitler was given a name that captures the Comanche assessment of the man with elegant economy. They called him Posa Taibu, which translates to crazy white man. Pyrotechnic signals became fancy fire. The code words were vivid, immediate, drawn from the physical world the Comanche knew, and completely opaque to anyone outside it. For proper nouns, place names, and words that had no Comanche equivalent, they developed a phonetic spelling system using Comanche words. The letter A was araka, the Comanche word for alligator. The letter D was sadi, the word for dog. Any word in any language could be spelled out letter by letter using Comanche terms that a non-Comanche listener would hear as a meaningless string of syllables from a language they had no reference point for. There was one additional layer of security that made the entire system functionally impenetrable. Even a fluent Comanche speaker who had not been briefed on the military code would not understand the transmissions. If a Comanche grandmother in Oklahoma had somehow tuned into the frequency and listened to her grandsons talking, she would have heard real Comanche words, but the words would have made no sense in context. She would have heard turtle and pregnant airplane and sewing machine gun and had no idea what they were communicating. The code was not simply Comanche, it was a cipher built on top of Comanche. You needed both the language and the military key to understand it. The language alone was not enough. The key alone was useless. You needed both, and the only people on Earth who had both were 17 young men from Oklahoma. A training code book was created for classroom use only. It was never carried into the field. This was a deliberate security measure. If a code talker was captured, there would be nothing on his person to reveal the system. No notebook, no reference card, no printed key. The men memorized the entire vocabulary, all 250 terms, plus the phonetic alphabet, plus the procedures for spelling out words that had no coded equivalent. They drilled it until the translations were automatic, until a man, hearing "send reinforcements to grid reference" from his officer, could convert it into Comanche and transmit it in seconds, without pausing to think, without hesitating over a word. The speed of the system was one of its great advantages. A message that would take 30 minutes to encrypt on an M209 cipher machine, transmit in Morse code, receive, and decrypt at the other end could be spoken in Comanche and understood by the receiving code talker in real time. The delay was essentially zero. The security was essentially perfect. It was faster than any machine and more secure than any cipher the army possessed. They carried the code in their heads, in a language that existed nowhere on paper, in no file cabinet, in no safe, in no headquarters building anywhere in the world. The entire system, from beginning to end, lived inside the memories of 17 men from southwestern Oklahoma. Of the 17 men recruited, 3 were discharged before deployment. Naquadi, Tabitite, and Wani left the service for various reasons. A fourth, Morris Tabiechi, was transferred to a corps-level cryptography role in England. The remaining 13 moved with the 4th Division through a series of stateside postings: Camp Gordon in Georgia, Fort Jackson in South Carolina, the Carolina and Louisiana maneuvers where they practiced the system in field conditions, Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida for amphibious training, and finally Fort Dix in New Jersey and Camp Kilmer before shipping out from New York. They arrived in England in late January of 1944, 4 months before D-Day. During this period, a notable cultural detail emerged. A lieutenant named Keene formed an all-Comanche boxing team from among the men, and before deployment many of the code talkers received blessed peyote buttons in Native American church ceremonies, a spiritual preparation that would later figure in how they explained their survival. That left 13 Comanche code talkers who would cross the English Channel and land on the coast of France. June 6, 1944, Utah Beach, 6:30 in the morning. The Fourth Infantry Division was one of the 2 American divisions assigned to the westernmost of the 5 D-Day invasion beaches. The plan called for the 4th to land on a specific stretch of sand, secure the causeways leading inland through the flooded areas behind the beach, and link up with the airborne troops of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions who had jumped into the Cotentin Peninsula during the night. The plan did not survive the English Channel. Strong tidal currents pushed the landing craft roughly 2,000 yards south of the intended beach sector. When the ramps dropped and the men waded ashore, they were not where they were supposed to be. The landmarks did not match the maps. The predetermined assault sectors were somewhere to the north, out of reach. On most beaches, on most days, this kind of navigational error would have produced confusion, delay, and the kind of command paralysis that kills men in the water while officers argue about maps. The Assistant Division Commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the eldest son of the 26th President of the United States, was among the first senior officers on the beach. Roosevelt was 56 years old. He walked with a cane. He had a heart condition that would kill him 5 weeks later. He had personally lobbied his division commander for permission to go ashore with the first wave, arguing that the presence of a general on the beach would steady the men. He was right. Roosevelt walked the shoreline under fire, compared what he could see with his map, identified the actual landmarks, and made one of the most consequential snap decisions of the entire invasion. He decided that the accidental beach was actually better than the planned one. The defenses here were lighter, the exits were usable, the causeways were accessible. He reportedly said words that have passed into the folklore of the 4th Division. He said, "We'll start the war from right here." What happened next was a textbook demonstration of the kind of rapid, decentralized decision-making that would characterize the best American operations for the rest of the war. Roosevelt did not radio back to the fleet for new instructions. He did not convene a staff meeting on the sand. He walked the beach, reorganized the units coming ashore, redirected them toward the new exits, and set the entire 4th Division on a course it had never planned to take. By the end of the day, the 4th Division had pushed further inland than any of the other assault divisions. Utah Beach, the landing that went wrong, became the landing that went right, because one general and the men around him adapted to the situation in front of them faster than the plan could have anticipated. Larry Saupitty, Private First Class, was in the middle of all of it. He was Roosevelt's radioman, driver, and orderly. He was on the beach beside the general when Roosevelt made his decision. And within minutes of the landing, Saupitty transmitted the first Comanche language combat message of the Second World War. In Comanche, he reported the equivalent of, "We made a good landing. We landed in the wrong place." That message traveled through the salt air, past every German intercept antenna along the Normandy coast, through the earphones of every Hurtgen operator scanning American frequencies, and arrived at the receiving end as clear, intelligible Comanche. Any German operator who happened to intercept it heard a strong, disciplined voice speaking something that was not listed in any signals intelligence manual the Wehrmacht possessed. Charles Chibitty, serving with the 22nd Infantry Regiment, transmitted shortly afterward. He reported that the regiment was 5 miles to the right of the designated landing area, already 5 miles inland, that the fighting was fierce, and that they needed support. That message, too, traveled in the clear. No encryption device, no cipher machine, no code pad, just a man speaking a language that almost no one on Earth outside of a small community in Oklahoma could understand, and only 13 of those speakers were in France. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of men like Larry Saupitty visible a little longer, and that matters more than I can say. The 13 Comanche code talkers were distributed in pairs across the 4th Division's 3 infantry regiments, with additional men stationed at division headquarters. Their job was not limited to speaking Comanche into a radio. They were members of the 4th Signal Company, and they did everything signal soldiers did. They laid wire. They repaired wire under fire. They recovered wire from positions the enemy had overrun. They operated switchboards. They drove trucks through shelled roads. They dug foxholes alongside infantrymen. The 4th Signal Company would lay more than 15,000 miles of communication wire between June 6, 1944, and the German surrender on May 8, 1945. The Comanche code talkers strung their share of it, sometimes under artillery fire, sometimes under sniper fire, sometimes in conditions where the simple act of climbing a telephone pole made a man the tallest target in the landscape. Roderick Red Elk earned a Bronze Star for climbing a pole approximately 20 feet high under direct enemy fire to string communication wire that had been severed by shell fire. The line was down. The units on either side of the break were blind without it. Red Elk did not wait for someone to volunteer. He did not ask for covering fire. He saw the broken line. He knew the line carried orders that men downrange were waiting for. He climbed the pole. He fixed the wire. He came back down. That was the kind of man he was, and that was the kind of war it was. After Utah Beach, the Fourth Infantry Division drove inland through the hedgerow country of Normandy, the same bocage that was grinding the American advance to a bloody crawl on the sectors east of them. In the bocage, every field was a separate fight. You could not see the unit on your flank. You could not see the enemy until you were close enough to hear him. Communication was the difference between coordinated action and isolated slaughter. Every radio transmission the Americans sent was a potential gift to the German intercept service, which was working around the clock to read American tactical traffic and feed it to German commanders. The German signals intelligence apparatus on the Western Front was formidable. The Hurtgen Intercept Service and the Signal Intelligence Command regiments fielded thousands of dedicated specialists tasked with intercepting, analyzing, and decrypting Allied communications. These were not rear echelon clerks. They were trained cryptanalysts, linguists, radio technicians, and traffic analysts who had been honing their skills through 5 years of war. Their results were real and they were documented. They had broken the Slidex tactical code, a widely used low-level American encryption system, and were reading it routinely, sometimes within hours of each day's new key period. The post-war interrogation of Major Rudolf Henze, who headed a German army cryptanalysis group, confirmed that Slidex was extensively exploited. They had also achieved significant results against the American M209 cipher machine, a mechanical encryption device that the Americans considered adequately secure for tactical traffic. German cryptanalysts at specialized evaluation centers processed intercepted M209 traffic and extracted operationally useful intelligence. During the Battle of the Bulge, German signal intelligence produced what cryptologic historians have called one of the most valuable operational results of the entire Western Front campaign by reading American cipher traffic and using it to anticipate Allied dispositions. Against this backdrop, the Comanche transmissions occupied a category the German apparatus had no tools to address. The Slidex code was breakable because it was a code, a systematic substitution that could be reverse-engineered by a trained cryptanalyst given enough intercepted material. The M209 was breakable because it was a machine, and every machine produces patterns when its rotors cycle through their positions. But the Comanche language was neither a code nor a machine output. It was a human language from a linguistic family that had no structural connection to anything spoken in Europe. A German linguist trained in a dozen European languages would find nothing recognizable in it. The sound system bore no resemblance to any Indo-European tongue. The grammatical architecture operated on principles that European linguistics had no framework to address. A German intercept operator listening to a Comanche transmission would not even be able to determine where one word ended and the next began, because the boundaries between words in spoken Comanche do not correspond to anything a European ear would naturally identify. And the only way to learn a human language of this kind is from another human being who already speaks it. There was no Comanche speaker anywhere in Europe outside of those 13 American soldiers. No published reference existed that could bridge the gap. The entire language lived only inside the people who had been born into it, and those people were on the other side of the war. A popular account, repeated in many retellings of the Code Talker story, holds that Germany sent approximately 30 anthropologists and linguists to the United States between the wars to study Native American languages, anticipating their military use after the Choctaw precedent in 1918. There is a kernel of truth in this. German ethnographers did study Native American cultures during this period. Gunther Wagner's work among the Comanche in 1932 is a documented example, but the dramatic version of the story, the one that describes a coordinated German intelligence operation targeting native languages as potential military codes, is thinly sourced and should be understood as popular retelling rather than established fact. What is established is that even 100 linguists would not have solved the problem. Comanche could not be learned from fieldwork notes. It had to be acquired from speakers, over years. And even then, even if a German analyst had somehow become fluent in conversational Comanche, he would still have been unable to decode the military transmissions because the code used Comanche words in ways no natural speaker would have recognized. Turtle did not mean turtle. It meant tank. You needed the language and the military key. The Germans had neither. The Fourth Division fought through the Bocage, participated in the capture of Cherbourg at the end of June, and was part of the Operation Cobra breakout that finally shattered the German defensive line at the end of July 1944. The Comanche code talkers went with it through every engagement. They transmitted through the drive across France. They transmitted through the fighting along the Siegfried Line, the fortified German border defenses. They transmitted through the Hurtgen Forest, the battle that the United States Army still considers one of the most costly and brutal engagements of the entire European war. The Hurtgen was a 50-square-mile stretch of dense pine forest straddling the German-Belgian border, and it swallowed American divisions whole between September of 1944 and February of 1945. The trees were so thick that artillery shells detonated in the canopy rather than on the ground, sending shrapnel and wood splinters downward in a lethal rain that foxholes could not protect against. Wire was severed almost as fast as signal soldiers could string it. Radio communication became critical because the wire could not stay intact, and yet radio communication was also difficult because the dense forest absorbed signals and made direction finding unreliable. The Comanche code talkers operated in these conditions alongside every other signal soldier in the Fourth Division. They laid wire through forests where snipers sat in the treetops. They repaired breaks in lines that ran through minefields. They transmitted from positions that were under observed artillery fire. The ordinary, grinding, invisible work of military communication, the work that never makes it into the highlight reels of the war, was what kept units connected and coordinated in terrain designed by nature and improved by the Germans to produce maximum confusion and maximum casualties. Charles Chibitty would remember the Hurtgen for the rest of his life. He described it in terms that match the accounts of every American soldier who survived that forest. He described frozen bodies lying in the snow along the roads. He described a road grader pushing the dead to the side so that trucks and tanks could pass. He described cold so deep that the men could not feel their hands on their weapons. He described the tree bursts, the artillery shells that hit the treetops and sprayed steel and wood fragments downward onto men who had no overhead cover. The Hurtgen Forest consumed American divisions the way a fire consumes timber. The Fourth Infantry Division went in at full strength and came out shattered. And through all of it, the Comanche code talkers continued to transmit. They continued to lay wire. They continued to do the unglamorous, indispensable work of military communication in conditions that made merely surviving a daily achievement. There is a detail about the code talkers in these months that is easy to overlook and worth pausing on. Unlike the infantrymen who could rotate out of the line, signal soldiers had to maintain communications wherever the division was fighting. When the division was in contact with the enemy, the wire had to stay up and the radios had to stay on. The code talkers could not be pulled back and replaced by other Comanche speakers because there were no other Comanche speakers in the entire European theatre. Each pair of code talkers in each regiment was irreplaceable. If one of them was killed or seriously wounded, the secure communication channel for that regiment simply ceased to exist. They knew this. Their commanders knew this. And yet they went forward alongside the infantrymen because the wire had to be strung and the messages had to be sent. When the German Ardennes offensive broke through on December 16, 1944, the 4th Division was thrown into the fighting at the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The code talkers transmitted through the chaos of that battle, where American units were being overrun, surrounded, and scattered across a front that had collapsed in multiple places. In conditions where German intercept teams were working at maximum capacity to exploit every piece of American radio traffic they could capture, the Comanche channel remained opaque. The same German apparatus that was reading American cipher traffic and gaining operational advantage from it could do nothing at all with the Comanche transmissions. The Fourth Division fought through the Bulge, crossed into Germany, and participated in the final drive into the Reich. In the spring of 1945, the division helped liberate concentration camps near Munich. The code talkers saw what was inside those camps. They saw what the war had been about in a way that no briefing or training film could have conveyed. They had fought for a year across Europe to defeat a regime that had tried to erase entire peoples from the face of the earth, and they had done it as members of a people that their own government had tried to erase. Through every engagement, from the beaches of Normandy to the camps of Bavaria, the code held. Not a single Comanche transmission was broken. Not a single operational compromise was traced to the Comanche communication channel. No German document recovered after the war. No post-war interrogation of German signals intelligence officers. No file in the extensive records captured by the Allied Target Intelligence Committee, known as TICOM, mentions Comanche language traffic by name. The Germans appear not to have identified it as a distinct communication system. They may have logged it as unidentified voice traffic on American frequencies. They may have filed it as an anomaly and moved on to the codes they could actually break. Whatever they did with it, they did not crack it. This is worth pausing on. The German Signals Intelligence Service broke the Slidex code. They broke the M209 cipher machine. They read American military police communications. They exploited tactical traffic during the Battle of the Bulge. They were staffed by mathematicians and linguists who had been doing this work for years, and they could not even identify the Comanche transmissions as a structured communication system, let alone decrypt them. The code talkers had not just beaten German cryptanalysis. They had operated beneath it entirely, in a space that German cryptanalysis did not even know existed. Several of the 13 were wounded during the war. Forrest Kassanavoid took shrapnel in the back. Larry Saupitty was wounded. Robert Holder was wounded. Perry Neuerbad was wounded. Willie Yakeshi was wounded. Neuerbad earned a Silver Star. Chibitty, Roderick Red Elk, Kassanavoid, and Holder each earned Bronze Stars. And not one of the 13 Comanche code talkers who landed on Utah Beach was killed. All 13 came home alive. Haddon Codina, when asked after the war how they had all survived, gave an answer that belongs to the Comanche world rather than the army's. He credited the peyote buttons they had been given before deployment in a Native American church ceremony. Each man had received a blessed piece of peyote to carry with him as protection. Codina said, "I was given a piece of peyote that had been blessed to keep me from harm. I think all the others were given one too. It must have worked, for all of us came back home. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What did they remember? Those details, the small, specific, personal things, matter more than any official archive. They are the actual record of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them." When the war ended, the Comanche code talkers came home to Oklahoma and stepped into a silence that would last for decades. Unlike the Navajo code talkers who served with the Marines in the Pacific and whose program was formally classified and remained secret until 1968, the Comanche men were never officially sworn to secrecy. No classification order was placed on their program. No officer debriefed them with instructions to keep quiet. The silence that settled over their story was not the silence of a government order. It was the silence of men who had seen things they did not want to describe to people who were not there, and the silence of a program so small that nobody outside of it knew enough to ask. Most of them went back to ordinary lives. They took jobs, they raised families. They did not talk much about what they had done. The country they had served did not ask them to. The Navajo Code Talker program eventually became famous. The Navajo program was much larger, involving roughly 400 men deployed across the Pacific Theater, with Marine divisions from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The first group of 29 Navajo recruits had developed their code at Camp Elliott and Camp Pendleton in California in 1942, and the first Navajo code talkers arrived at Guadalcanal in September of that year. By the time the war ended, the Navajo code had been used in every major marine operation in the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo code talkers worked around the clock during the first 2 days of the battle. They sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. The signal officer of the 5th Marine Division, Major Howard Connor, said afterward that the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima without the Navajo code talkers. That single endorsement, from a professional signal officer who had watched the system perform under the most intense combat conditions the Pacific War produced, is one of the strongest testimonials any military communication system has ever received. The Navajo story entered American popular consciousness through books, through documentaries, and through a 2002 Hollywood film called Wind Talkers. The Comanche story, the story of 17 men in one army signal company on the other side of the world, remained almost completely unknown. There were no films about them. There were almost no articles. Most Americans had never heard their names. The disparity was not a matter of merit. It was a matter of scale and timing. 400 men generate more visibility than 17. A classified program generates more mystique when it is declassified than a program that was never classified at all. Both programs shared the same foundation, and they were not alone. Across both theaters of the war, Native American soldiers from more than a dozen tribes served as code talkers. Choctaw, Cherokee, Lakota, Meskwaki, Hopi, Mohawk, Tlingit, Crow, Kiowa, Seminole, Muskogee Creek, Pawnee, and others contributed their languages to the war effort. Some, like the Comanche and Navajo, developed formal coded vocabularies with designated military terms. Others used their languages in a more direct, informal way, simply speaking naturally on the radio and relying on the impenetrability of the language itself to provide security. When the Congressional Gold Medal was eventually awarded, 33 tribes were recognized. 33 languages that the United States government had tried to erase were languages that the United States military had needed in order to win. All of these programs depended on languages that the enemy could not learn, languages that existed only in the oral traditions of peoples whose own government had tried to erase them. And both programs carried the same bitter, irreducible irony. The Navajo, like the Comanche, had been sent to boarding schools. The Navajo, like the Comanche, had been punished for speaking their language. Both peoples had been told that their words were worthless, and then the United States asked them to speak those worthless words into a radio in the middle of the worst war in human history, because those words were the one thing the enemy absolutely could not break. Charles Chibitty understood the irony more clearly than anyone. Years after the war, speaking as an old man looking back on a lifetime that stretched from a boarding school punishment room to a beach in Normandy, he said it plainly. He said, "It is strange, but growing up as a child I was forbidden to speak my native language at school. Later my country asked me to. My language helped win the war, and that makes me proud. Very proud." That sentence, spoken by a man who had been disciplined for speaking Comanche as a child and decorated for speaking Comanche as a soldier, contains the entire history of the United States' relationship with its native peoples compressed into 4 lines. Recognition, when it came slowly, and it came mostly after the men who deserved it were no longer alive to receive it. On November 3, 1989, France awarded the Chevalier de l'Ordre National du Mérite to the 3 Comanche code talkers who were still living. Charles Chibitty, Forrest Kassanavoid, and Roderick Red Elk stood at the Oklahoma state capitol and received from the government of France a recognition that their own government had not yet given them. France remembered what America had not yet chosen to remember. Kassanavoid died in 1996. Roderick Red Elk died in 1997. By the late 90s, Charles Chibitty was the last Comanche code talker alive. On November 30, 1999, the Department of Defense presented Chibitty with the Knowlton Award at the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. He was 78 years old. He accepted it alone. Chibitty spent his last years in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he had worked in the building trades after the war. He was a nationally recognized champion fancy war dancer, a traditional Comanche art form that he had practiced his entire life, maintaining a connection to his culture that the boarding schools had tried to sever, and the war had, in its own strange way, validated. Fellow Comanche honored him as a hereditary chief, a title that connected him through his family line to Chief Ten Bears, the leader who had signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty more than a century before. The boy from Medicine Park who had been punished for speaking his language at school had become a living link to a Comanche leadership that predated the United States itself. Chibitty died on July 20, 2005, of complications from diabetes. He was 83 years old. He was buried at Floral Haven Memorial Gardens in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. With his death, the last living voice of the Comanche Code went silent forever. There was no one left who had memorized the military vocabulary, who had spoken the words turtle and pregnant airplane and crazy white man into a field radio on a beach in France while German intercept operators listened and heard nothing they could use. On November 20, 2013, 8 years after Chibitty's death, the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the code talkers of 33 Native American tribes. The ceremony was held in Emancipation Hall at the United States Capitol. Chairman Wallace Coffey accepted the Comanche Nation's gold medal. Members of Chibitty's family accepted his individual silver medal on his behalf. The Comanche Nation brought 137 descendants to Washington on a bus that had been custom-wrapped with the images and names of the code talkers. Every single one of the Comanche code talkers was dead by the time the medal was struck. So here is the answer to the question the German intercept operators could never resolve. What were they hearing on those American frequencies? Why could the most capable signals intelligence service in Europe, an organization that routinely broke American codes and cipher machines, fail completely against a system operated by 13 men carrying no encryption equipment at all? The answer is that the Comanche code was not a code in any sense that cryptanalysis could address. A code is a system. A system has structure. Structure produces patterns. Patterns can be detected, analyzed, and broken. The Comanche language was not a mathematical system. It was a culture. It was the accumulated oral tradition of a people who had lived on the southern plains for centuries, who had developed a way of speaking so complex, so tonal, so deeply embedded in a specific way of seeing the world, that no outsider could acquire it without years of immersion among the people who spoke it. The Germans could not break it for the same reason you cannot pick a lock that is not a lock. It was not a mechanism. It was a living thing. You either grew up inside it, or you did not. The 13 Comanche code talkers who landed on Utah Beach belonged to that living thing. They belonged to a language and a culture that the United States government had spent 60 years trying to destroy. They carried that language through the schools that had tried to silence it, through a war that desperately needed it, and home again to a country that would take another 6 decades to say thank you. They were not code machines. They were Comanche men who spoke a language their mothers had taught them, a language that had traveled down through generations so far back that no one remembered where it began. And when the moment came, when the army needed a communication system that no power on earth could defeat, the answer was not a machine, and not a cipher, and not a mathematical formula. The answer was a boy from Medicine Park, Oklahoma, speaking the words his mother had given him into a radio on a beach in France, while the most advanced signals intelligence service in Europe listened and understood nothing at all. Forrest Kassanavoid, asked years later about what it all meant, said it with a simplicity that no historian has ever improved upon. He said, "We brought home a lot of Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars, but no one was killed. There was some joy in the fact that we served this country of ours. This country of ours." He said that. A Comanche veteran with shrapnel scars on his back, a man whose people had been conquered, relocated, and systematically stripped of their language by the government of that country, called it ours. That single word, spoken without bitterness by a man who had earned the right to be bitter, is either the most generous thing any American veteran has ever said about his country, or the most quietly devastating. It is probably both. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps this story reach the viewers who care about getting the history right. Not the history that flatters us, and not the history that flattens us, but the history that actually happened, with the names, the details, and the inconvenient truths intact. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men in ordinary uniforms who, at one specific moment in their lives, were asked to give something that no training manual could have taught them and no government report could have measured. The Comanche code talkers gave it in a language their country had tried to take from them, and their country never said thank you until every one of them was gone.